So I don't know if you could see the website at the bottom there, but what I'm going to be presenting today is a very small fraction of what's on that website. So if there's any of stuff that I talk about today, there'll be more stuff on that website, and there's other things on the website which I've edited out just because of time. And as I was saying to you, this is probably my last presentation. So this is your last chance to catch me.
Well, you can always join us without making a presentation, of course, Stu.
It's very hard to quieten me down, though, which is sort of interesting because in Jungian terms, I'm an introvert.
Yes.
Except when I'm presenting. So I'm it's like I've been a vegetarian. I've been a seasonal vegetarian. So I'd eat vegetables in winter and meat in summer, rather the other way around, meat in winter and vegetables in summer. But I'm an introvert when I'm not on the platform. So here I am, as I started out in life. So I was born in Britain during the war, and so I was born in Aylesbury. And when you're born in Aylesbury, you're known as an Aylesbury duckling, which is what I am. And I wasn't. I was difficult to give birth to, so I had to be pulled out with forceps and all that sort of stuff. And my mother wasn't able to breastfeed me instantly, and they didn't have much patience for helping her. So I didn't get breastfed. I got cow's milk pushed into me. And later in life, I worked with a whole lot of medical practitioners, and I was also president of the Society for Emotionally Disturbed Children, and we did workups on all those children. And the commonest cause of emotional disturbance, paradoxically, is allergy to cow's milk. So 60% of those people were allergic to cow's milk. And that's what I started out in life on.
So did most of them start in life, did they find on cow's milk?
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole field of allergy is very interesting, that people in England, where I grew up, were mostly allergic to cow's milk. South Americans are mostly allergic to corn, and Chinese are mostly allergic to rice, because the first thing they were all given as children was either rice or milk or corn. And the body is only adapted to digesting mother's milk, and anything else is a poison, in a sense, that the body has got to adapt to. And the paradox is that what is done as part of that adaptation is that the body produces a lot of cortisone to defend itself, and cortisone is a stimulant. So paradoxically, all of us got addicted to the thing that we are allergic to.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's a big problem for. So there's a progress from allergy to addiction to reactions to eventually degenerative diseases. And if you can get off the thing you're addicted to, it's really important. And when I worked with doctors who were into this, the first thing they got their patients to do was keep a diary of their diet, and anything they repeatedly ate or exposed themselves to, they put a circle around it and said, this is what we're going to try and eliminate and see what happens. And with all of the children I worked with in Montreal, they'd all been labeled the problem child of the family, and they all ended up as the genius of the family once they were off cow's milk. And the second thing was wheat. For Europeans, was they were allergic. 30% were allergic to wheat. And so you can break the adaptation, and you can't actually see the adaptation unless you fast for 4 days. And if you then reintroduce the thing that's suspect, you get an acute response. Whereas if you keep getting exposed to it, you get a latent response, which is not dramatic. Anyway, so this was my grandfather, who is my mother's father, and he grew up. I don't know if you can see the whole picture, but I can't see the whole picture, but with the bit at the top. But
no, only the second.
Yeah, there's a
line.
couple of windows it looks like you've got open that are blocking it out, and we just see it as grey.
So what can I do?
Try moving your go to the background and try moving your windows around a little bit. See that's changed it.
Background. Okay. Wait a
Oh
minute.
no! Don't look for the word background. I mean just
no, I don't know how to. Is that something you can get in and do? Because I don't know how to do that.
No, I can't really intervene at this point.
You're getting your subtitles now.
If I press
OK. Somehow you've switched on the
What? What if I disappear my? Oh, wait a minute.
We could see most of it.
You could close your screen sharing and then open it up again.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would change because it was the same before.
Oh. Let me try again. Oh dear. How do we do it? Oh yeah, here we go. Now that shows the whole of that one.
So it might see how it goes with the next.
Yes.
Bit more.
Yeah, that's showing more.
Yeah, okay.
Mentored by my grandfather.
Yeah.
Partner's
So
children.
he like a lot of people in the 1800s, went to work when he was 8 or 9, and he worked as a comp in a factory, in a printing factory, with having had virtually no education, which was amazing because he would have had to spell properly and all that sort of stuff. But why I say he was my mentor, I remember a really powerful experience, which I'll come back to talking about a bit later, is I was about 3, and he said in his Buckinghamshire accent, "Today's the day I'm going to go and plant the potatoes." And I said, "Why today, Gramps?" And he took my hand and we walked outside, and he looked up at the sky and he said, "Whirr." And then he looked at the soil and he said, "Ah." And that was his answer, which I came to call the whir and ah factor. And in working with people around the world on all sorts of issues, people who were able to do anything meaningful relied on whir and ah. And people who relied on data couldn't solve problems because the solutions for the problems were outside the data. So I've always been very suspicious of people who talk about evidence-based decision-making, and you'll see why that in a minute. Okay, so just to say about my connection with general semantics. So Rachel Lauer was the person who in 1983 gave a talk at McGill, and she talked about her 5 epistemes, which are really, really important. And I don't see very much about this in the literature of general semantics. So
Have
it's
you written any
something
books
that
by
needs to
Bois?
be talked about a bit more. So she said, our understanding goes through 5 stages. The first is recognizing a thing, which is what happened with the origins of general semantics, that it was recognized as this is something that's important that we need to talk about. The second stage is starting to try and define what the hell this thing is, and starting to measure it and describe it and get to know what it is. And this is the stage that most thinking ever gets to. And this second stage is what I call monitoring our extinction research. Is if we talk about problems in our society, in Australia, it's a classic case that we have all sorts of problems, and the government gives funding to researchers who go and study it. And all they do with the money invariably is measure the problem. And you look at how much money is spent on the environment and how much money is spent on social unrest. Most of it goes to measuring the problem, or possibly occasionally trying to come up with some curative, what I call back-end solutions. There's nothing pretty much invariably done at what I call the front end, which is where real research needs to take place. Real research is about design and management. And how do you design systems that don't have the problem? Not how do you measure the problem and try and cure the problem at the back end of the issue. So the third stage that she described is to try and see what's the relationship between this thing, in this case, general semantics, and other things. And around the time general semantics was being formulated, there were all sorts of other developments. Social ecology was one of them. Systems analysis was another. The whole humanistic psychology field was getting up and running. Alternative political systems were in the field. And then there were a whole lot that were under the umbrella of religion and quasi-religion and so forth. So there were a lot of things. I think the danger is when people discover something, they then start not being that interested in other things. And I think that, for me, was lacking in general semantics in the literature I've looked at. There wasn't enough engagement with other systems and seeing what are the relationships between this system and other systems. And if you do engage with other systems, you start to see that there are some common characteristics. And that enables you to have questions about the system you're interested in and the relationships with other systems. And that's a critical stage, which is rare in our society. What's even rarer is the next stage, which she said, once you've gone through that known bits and pieces, you need to get open to the unknownness of whatever the thing is, and not just the ownness, but all its paradoxical qualities. And so for me, in all the things I've studied in my life, if I'm not recognizing paradox, I know I've missed something. So for example, I spent a lot of my life studying pest control, and in pest control, the pest is treated as the enemy. But most pests are not only enemies, they're also serving a valuable function. So for example, aphids feeding on leaves in trees stick their mouth parts in the leaf, and some of the juices of the tree flows through the body of the aphid and drips out of the rear end of the aphid onto the litter underneath. And that juice going out has a lot of sugar in it. And that sugar initiates the whole decomposition process of the litter under the tree. And it's broken down by a fungus called Mucor hymalis. And that fungus initiates the decomposition process of the leaf litter. If it wasn't for that pest, then there would be an incredible delay in decomposition. My take is anything you understand going on anywhere is pretty much the same sort of thing that's going on everywhere. And so for me, there's a whole lot in general semantics that hasn't scratched the surface of these sort of paradoxical and unknown aspects. So for you lot listening to this, and anybody who listens to a recording of this, there's an opportunity for a Nobel Prize if you actually got into that. The reason these things are not got into is because when people come across something that is difficult for them to deal with at that moment, the primary strategy that is evident is denial. And when like for a whole lot of entomologists, I would say about aphids providing nutrients for decomposition. Oh, no, that can't be important. You know, the main thing about aphids is they're a pest and we need to get rid of them. And even if there isn't denial, there's usually postponement of engaging with the information. Oh yeah, that's interesting. So for example, in sharing this video with other people, people might look at a bit of it and think, oh, that's interesting, but you know, it's going to be quite challenging to really engage with this. So I'll wait till I'm ready. And most postponement never gets actualized. It remains postponed. And it's the sort of thing that, you know, people have said, the appropriate inscription on most graves should be spent my life getting ready to live, never actually lived. And that's the very sad thing about postponement. Sometimes it leads to blaming others. Sometimes it involves complaining. And then particularly in research, it involves trying to come up with emergency measures to solve the problem. And as a friend of mine who is a medical practitioner said, to understand this, you have to remember that none of us suffer from a headache because of a deficiency of aspirin in the blood. And
there's a good example recently, the Liberal Party.
Oh, yes.
About when they had to put their people in for the vote and they postponed it too much and they missed the deadline. And now they're into the blame, complaining and emergency measures.
Exactly. And so that thing, you know, as I was saying earlier, anything you see anywhere is going on everywhere. And that I think that Liberal Party failure to identify people and record them is a classic example. Then we get into distractive and compensatory activities. And throughout the world, sport and consumption are the primary distractive activities. You know, again, one of my friends who was a nutritionist, who people used to say to him, well, what can you advise me to do to stay healthy through diet? And he said, well, there's just really one thing that we all need to do, is because most people shop in the supermarket, is keep out of the center aisles. Because the food is around the perimeter. Down one side, there's a bit of fruits and vegetables, and down the other side, there's a bit of meat, and there's some bread in the corner. And in the middle, you've got food that makes a noise when you pour milk on it that we have zero requirement for. So that was his advice. And that similarly, we're completely obsessed with sport. And I'll come back to that a bit later, because sport is primarily a distractive activity that maintains competition over collaboration and all sorts of hierarchical systems and so forth. So that would be a very hard thing to talk about in Australia. Curative problem-solving interventions, what I call back-end solutions, not front-end solutions, and endless research, usually not on the whole system, but on bits of the system. And the reason, as a researcher, you research bits of the system is you can only get reproducible results with little bits of the system. If you're looking at the whole system, you can't carry out research that has enough replicates to be able to make a statement. So research sets us up for failure of doing meaningful research. And
Could you
at the
define a
same
little bit
time,
more what you mean by back end and front end intervention?
well, if I look at agriculture, and there's a whole lot of things on my website with pictures of this. If you look at agriculture as a circle with a dent in it, and where there's a dent, and there's a problem, little bits of the system flying off, which could be a pest, say. What we initially try to do is to produce something that gets rid of the pest, like a cloud of pesticide. And that's the conventional solution. When we find there's some side effects of that, we then try to be more judicious with our use of the magic bullet solution. So we try to monitor the pest and only apply the pesticide when the pest is there. Or we might electrically charge the pesticide so that it electrostatically jumps on the pest. And that's the efficiency approach to solving a problem. If eventually you might say, well, we don't even want to use a pesticide. So then you get into trying to come up with alternatives to pesticides. And so there's biological controls, parasites and pathogens and predators and so forth that could control the pest.
Like
Paradoxically, the more effective you are with all of these solutions, and those are all what I call back-end solutions, paradoxically, you're protecting the system that's generating the problem. So the front-end solution is trying to find out how do you redesign that whole agroecosystem or whatever the system is we're talking about to prevent the problem. So that's a front-end solution, is a design approach. The back-end approach is a problem-solving approach.
Thank you.
So if we're going to do this, we've got to start connecting all the things we're thinking about to our deepest values. And one of the people, Lawrence Lashan, many years ago, said, well, when you boil it all down, at every moment, you have a choice of acting on love or acting on fear. And I practiced as a psychotherapist for many years, as well as a scientist and so forth. And all the problems I was dealing with people in psychology as clients were caught up with having developed patterns of acting on fear. And in a sense, what they've got to do to change the way they live is to make a choice to act on love. And I'll say more about that later. I'll also say more about this, which is the most challenging thing you're going to hear from me today, is if you lie, but if you boldly lie about what you've done that you haven't done, it's actually paradoxically a contradiction to what normally happens when you ask people, what do you really want to do? Subconsciously, we come up with something, and all our wounded adaptive selves, because we're all made up of multiple selves, all those adaptive selves subconsciously censor what you subconsciously might have come up with. So they would have said, oh, no, you'll never be able to do that. You never achieve anything. Oh, you couldn't tell anybody that's what you want to do. They'd laugh at you. You know, all those sort of subconscious things that stop you saying what you really want to do. So what we say, well, I'll tell the story about this because this will illustrate it. Yeah, probably 20 years ago, I was running a workshop in Dubbo with about 200 grazier families on how to make their grazing operations completely ecologically sustainable. And I asked them in pairs to brainstorm what they would do to make their operation more sustainable, something they would do. And then I asked for a go round. And this classic grazier, 7 foot tall with a shaved head and talking at the rate of treacle going down a very shallow slope, said, I'll put a solar collector on my dam. And I thought, well, that is very good, but it's not very exciting. And I was actually quite disappointed that that was the sort of level of the responses. And it was surprising to me that nobody said anything very creative about how they would redesign their grazing operation or their pasture operation. They all came up with things like that. And so I said, okay, you guys get back in your pairs and you boldly lie about what you've done to make your whole operation completely sustainable as a lie about what you've done that you haven't actually done. And the noise in the room was deafening, and it was really hard to get them to stop. They really got into it. And afterwards, I said, okay, let's have a go round. Does anybody want to share one? And wouldn't you know, the same guy who said about putting a solar collector on his dam, he said, I got one. He said, and this is exactly what he said. And note the contrast between this and the solar collector on his dam. He said, 20 years ago, I put a nature strip right through my 200,000 hectare property. And I've been monitoring the bird species ever since. I like those birds, he says. I've got 200 species of birds now. And then with a twinkle in his eye, he said, got up this morning to monitor me birds. You know those little bloody dinosaurs? I saw one of those bastards coming out of me nature strip. Well, of course, immediately I thought, I've discovered something that I have no knowledge about. And so I then said to them, get back in your pairs and brainstorm anything that you've actually done that's got anything to do with your lie. And this guy said, well, I put a windbreak between 2 of my paddocks. And I noticed the birds on these trees. And I thought, if I was a bird, I'd want more than one bloody row of trees. And I'd want some undergrowth. And so I got them back in their pairs, and I got them to brainstorm what would be a next step from what they've done towards their lie. And so for this guy, it was researching some plants he could put under these trees and how he could put in some more rows of trees. And then they brainstormed how they would get what they needed and what might get in the way and how they might get around anything that would get in the way. And eventually I had them brainstorm what's an action that you can absolutely guarantee to take towards your lie. And this guy said he knew somewhere where you could get plant seedlings that would go well under these trees, and he would go and get those. And for some people, they said more ambitious things, and I kept asking them, can you guarantee to do this? And if they said, well, 99.9% I can. And I said, I'm not interested in 99.9%. I only am interested in what you absolutely can guarantee to do, because the only way that change takes place is the next step from something that's actually been done. And so I said to these people, I don't mind if the only thing you can guarantee to do is to tell somebody what happened today when you get home. And so why this works is because it's a lie, it paradoxically comes out of our core unwounded self. And so you're actually hearing what your unwounded self really wants to do. Whereas when you ask people what would they like to do, what you hear is not what comes out of their core self, what comes out of their adaptive selves. And what goes on in our society is over 80% is communication between adaptive selves. And if you watch the discussion in Parliament every day, all that discussion is boring conversations between wounded adaptive selves until somebody dies and somebody gets up and speaks from the heart, from the core self, and says some appreciation of such and such a person who's died. And it doesn't take long to get back into the boring stuff, because it takes a lot of courage and commitment to stay with the core self stuff. But I'll come back to this later. But I want to anchor, this is the most important thing I'm communicating with you, is finding a way to boldly lie about a doable thing that you've done that you haven't actually done, as a way of taking a significantly important next step in your journey. Culturally, we've got to also not just be concerned with ourselves, but to be working with the community, and particularly never asking questions that can be answered with yes or no, but ask what Fran Peavy called strategic questions. How do you do things? Why is this, and so forth? No, yes and no questions lead to an end of conversation and an end of action. And focus on the smallest meaningful initiatives that we can guarantee to carry through to completion. Like me saying to those people, if the only thing you can guarantee to do is tell somebody about this, that's perfectly enough. And also, in thinking about this, think about how we can work with all the things we're doing in the short term in the service of the longer term. A part of the system in connection with the whole system, with the now, with the forever and ever. Okay. Well, I don't know. Are there any questions or comments anybody wants to make before we go on to the next bit? Is everybody still there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Honestly,
a comment I would make about the use of the word lie, which is generally distasteful for general semanticists in terms of not accurately mapping territory, where what you're saying is a map, of course, that may not relate to the territory. I like the idea of just shifting that slightly and calling it a fantasy, imagination. Imagining the grazier's paddock with the windbreaks and the birds and so forth.
Yeah.
As Albert Einstein used to allegedly say that imagination was far more important than intellect in solving problems, And so to let your imagination run wild about even if it's unrealistic, about the grazier's property, whatever, could be a powerful technique. So
Well,
I'm very excited by your recollection of that seminar with the graziers.
right. Well, let me give you an answer to this. And it's not necessarily an answer that you will be comfortable with you, because I'm very aware of how the concept of lying, which has been brainwashed into us from small children, is a bad thing. And is that I've tried using other terms and none of them work as well as lying. And I'll tell you why. Take imagination, for example. Imagining is an ability.
Yeah.
And so imagining is subject to subconscious criticism and censoring by all our wounded selves that would say, you're not going to be able to imagine very well because you're a fuckwit, and so imagining actually doesn't work. It feels like it should work, but it actually doesn't work. So out of practice, I can tell you the only thing that works is lying, boldly lying. And the reason it works is because it doesn't require a learned capability. It does. You can't get a PhD in lying. You can get a PhD in imagining. It's not a quality that you would be proud of, And paradoxically, because it's a quality you're not proud of, it paradoxically enables you to get to the essence of who you are, whereas imagining keeps you in the shallow end of the pool. And it's, there's lots of alternatives people come up with. Oh, the big story, something really wonderful, all sorts of alternative things, but none of them work. And it's that paradox is being willing. It's being willing to not be in denial about the power of lying and to take a risk and be willing to give it a go. And it doesn't work. I don't think it works very easily doing it on your own. It may primarily works if you've got somebody coaching you, asking you to boldly lie about whatever it is. Anyway, I'll come back to this.
I suppose lying, you're looking at what you would like yourself to do, like you're focusing on your dream version of yourself.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
So you're
uncensored.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let me give you a bit more of an example of this. Is when I got back from the workshop, I was back to teaching social ecology, and I thought, oh, how can I use this in teaching my students? So I then had an amazing idea. I was just starting the term and we were having the first lecture, and I explained what social ecology was. And I said, I'm open for you to ask me any questions you want about social ecology so you can get a really good understanding of what the hell this thing is. A bit like Rachel Lauer's first stage. What is this thing? And after they'd done that, and I drew some sort of stuff on the board with a whiteboard marker to, as we call, rich picture the subject. Then I said to them, okay, I want you to imagine that this actually isn't the first class. It's actually the last class of the semester. And in pairs, I want you to boldly lie about the 3 most important things you learned during the semester, which we haven't yet had. So there are 3 bold lies about things you've learned that you haven't actually yet learned. And again, the noise in the room was deafening. So I wrote all these things that I went around and I got all of them, and I got them to tell me what these things they learned were. And I wrote them all on the board. But on the board, unknown to them, I had areas of the board where I wrote environmental things, and areas where I wrote social things, and areas where I wrote personal things, and areas where I wrote the other things, which for some people were spiritual, for others were just unknown or mystical, and so forth. And then I put big circles around all the social things and ecological things and so forth, and drew lines between them so you could see a map of what they came up with. And then I stood back and said, now have a look at that. And what you may not realize is you've actually collectively created the curriculum for this term. And that's exactly what we're going to study for the rest of the term, is exactly what you've written that you already learned. And so I erased all that. I took a photo of it. So they all got a photo of a map of their curriculum. And then because we had no exams in social ecology, everything was evaluated on the basis of presentations and projects. So I said, now, looking at all those things, I want you to now boldly lie about a project that you've successfully carried out that's based on the knowledge that you got during this semester that you haven't yet got. So this is another bold lie. So they then did that in pairs, and then I wrote all those projects on the board. And I then said to them, now, just let your gaze wander over all those projects and notice where your attention settles. And then just go and write your initials under the project that seems to attract your attention more than any other one. And it doesn't matter how many initials there are written under a project. Lots of people can carry out the same project because the way they'll carry it out will be different. And then I said, what you've just done is actually identify the project that you're going to carry out during this semester. Now, what came out of this was that there was absolutely no problem with motivation. Like if I look at my colleagues, they spend enormous amount of time trying to get their students motivated. All these students were absolutely motivated from beginning to end because they were carrying out what their core selves were interested in and committed to doing. And they carried out phenomenal projects. And most of those students have gone on to be phenomenal people, and in most cases, obvious leaders in our society. And yeah, I mean, there's so much more to say about all of this, but it wouldn't have worked if I'd asked them to imagine. It only worked if I asked them to lie about what they'd learned that they hadn't actually learned. So can I go on to the next one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
So this is what I was saying earlier. It's my concern with science, and it's a little bit my concern with, for me, the overemphasis on science in general systems, general semantics approach. This dot is the total sum of human knowledge. And that's what science can investigate. That's what science can say something about. That's all come out of science and engagement. That dot occurs within a vast area of the unknown. And when people talk about evidence-based decision-making, they're actually talking about making decisions about that larger circle based on this minuscule little amount of information that we have in this dot. And it's what you'll see in a minute, what Einstein said, it's the dot is about cleverness. The unknown can only be engaged with through experience, intuition, and wisdom, whatever that is. And this drawing came out of a great book by André Voisin called Soil, Grass, and Cancer, in which he cited Schopenhauer in coming up with this stuff. That whole phenomena of the difference between the known and the unknown is the same difference between our conscious brain, the bit we know about, and our subconscious brain. It's, for me, working with those farmers, it's the difference between this minuscule little bit of the system that we label as crops and livestock to the rest of the landscape, to the world that occurs out of sight, which is particularly the world that occurs in the soil. And that's the world that I spent most of my research life investigating what's going on in soil. So, and I'll come back to that. But as Einstein said, clever people know how to solve problems. And people think, oh God, if I was only a bit more clever, I could be better at solving problems. So that's the thing that is really important to be aware of. We tend to over-focus on knowledge and data and neglect wisdom and experience, partly because knowledge and data is controllable and manageable and doable. Wisdom and experience is a vast area of mystery and unknown and variability and so forth. And that's the problem, is that wisdom can't be supported by data in the same way as cleverness can be supported with data. And I sense in general semantics, there's a fear of that area and a comfort with sticking with science and the known and da-di-da-di-da. So I think the challenge for you folks is to let go of that safety and step into the risky area of engaging with the unknown. So how we progress is, in fact, moving between unknowing and knowing. So you've got to be willing to be in unknowing to learn. So, for example, me talking about lying is and you know, wanting to say about imagination and so forth, it's really important to actually anchor yourself in I don't know about lying, to really be able to learn about lying. Getting over into imagination is getting into a little bit of safety, and it's stopping the possibility of actually learning about the power of lying. So it's really important to challenge that. We have to be in knowing to act, or the illusion of knowing. And the whole process is a process of moving between knowing and unknowing. Because when we think we know something, questions come up and observations come up that we don't have answers to, and that takes us into unknowing. And so that process is not a linear process, it's a spiral process. And there's I can't remember their name, but there's some famous philosophers who've come up with a process of thinking about things in a better way. But they've actually, the U theory. The U theory. And the U is just a bent linear thing. you know, if you turn a linear piece of chord around, you can create a U. It's still a linear process. It's not till we get to a spiral that we're actually in the possibility of progressing. Now, my experience is, and this actually came out of a incredibly powerful book called I'll have his name in a minute. It'll be at the bottom. Anyway, he looked at the great psychologists, Jung, Adler, and Freud, and he characterized their thinking relating to these three stages in our thinking process. And the book is called Profound Simplicity by Professor Schutz. And it's a brilliant book to read. So the first stage, just like the wanting to come up with magic bullet solutions to problems, is to come up with a simple solution and a simple explanation, which to me, in some ways, and I don't want to over-criticize imagination, but in some ways, imagination is a deceptively simple solution to avoiding lying. Oh, what, I'm going the wrong way. The next.
So a deceptively simple solution would be, if there's too much alcoholism, we ban alcohol and have prohibition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, every area you look at, you can see deceptively simple solutions. We don't suffer from crime because of a deficiency of prisons. We don't suffer from ignorance because of a lack of schools. You know, we don't suffer from ill health because of a lack of hospitals. All of these areas, we've over-prioritized the deceptively simple solution. When you look at any of those areas, after a while, we realize that it's quite complex. So there are a whole lot of interactive factors that are involved, and they're very hard to research because of their complexity. And that at that stage, it can become paralyzing. You can throw up your hands and say, oh, it's hopeless, you know. And my thing is, as a teacher, I paradoxically would say, I can only be an effective teacher if I can confuse my students. I need to get them into that feeling of confusion, because the only way they get to the next stage is as a solution to confusion. And the next stage is what Schutz called profound simplicity. It's what it, and it comes back to what I was saying, the smallest meaningful initiative we can carry through to completion. Simplicity is the doable thing that I have the competence and capability to do within the context, within the environment, given the resources that are available in the environment. It's a very, very small thing. And that's what a profound simplicity is. It's something that is time and place and competence relevant. And that's what the stages we've got to go through, just like Rachel Lauer's stages of thinking. We've got to move on from deceptive simplicity to get confusion and to enable the emergence of profound simplicity from that. That's a big challenging thought. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that. If not, I'll go back to soil. I said I spent a lot of my life looking at soil. Now, when you look at soil like that, it just looks like a dead thing. And within the landscape, when you look out on the landscape and you see all the vegetation and all the wildlife, however much you see in terms of number of species and biomass and so forth, there is always more species and more biomass and more going on under the ground, out of sight. And again, just like I was saying, anything you understand anywhere is what's going on everywhere. And what's going on under the ground is a whole lot of processes that are primarily concerned with decomposition. So if you look in the middle, just at the step forwards from the leaves to bacteria, which go on to being eaten by protozoa and nematodes and so forth. And then on the left of that, the molds, which are being browsed on by mites and springtails, and then they're being fed on by predators and so forth. And then over on the right, there's some things that can chomp up whole chunks of litter, earthworms and some insects and so forth. All of that life is phenomenal in the soil. And what I particularly did a lot of research on was the relationship between molds or fungi and mites that feed on the fungi, fungivorous mites. And what I found was that those mites, quite a few of which are named after me because I discovered them. So they have, the last name is Hilly. And that insect on the right there, it says feather-winged beetles, Tiliidae. They're the smallest beetles in the world, and the smallest one of those I discovered, and it's named after me, and it's called Microdina hilly.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, and particularly those mites, well, I'll show you some of those mites, because they have to distribute themselves in the soil. And one of the ways they distribute themselves is when a dung beetle is feeding on a bit of dung and is about to take off, it gives off a bit of an odor. It's like, a dung beetle farts, and all the mites that need a ride jump out of the dung, get on the back of the dung beetle, and get carried to the next pile of dung. And that's a common phenomena in nature, is hitching a ride on things. We have all sorts of animals that hitch a ride on us. Anyway, those mites for 400 million years have been farming fungi, and they do it in amazing ways. So we thought we invented farming. They were doing farming 400 million years ago. In incredibly sophisticated ways. So anyway, I won't go into it, but if anybody wants to ask me about that afterwards, I'll tell the story how that works. It's phenomenal. Oh yeah, no, we go back. Okay. So now I want to, soil was one big area, and ecology and agriculture and sustainable agriculture. Just incidentally, way back in 1974, I set up the first institute in a university in the world on ecologically sustainable agriculture, which is called Ecological Agriculture Projects. And we've published hundreds of papers about how we can be ecologically sustainable. About that time, my wife's mother was dying, and my wife got very depressed, and she went to see a psychotherapist. And being a typical English male, I thought, oh, good, she's going to sort herself out and go and do some therapy. And I thought, therapy, yeah, that's what Americans do. I don't need to go and do therapy. And it started to look really interesting after a few months of her doing this therapy. And I decided, because I was always interested in learning, I'll go and find out what this therapy is all about. And the type of therapy she was doing was very, very engaging and challenging. To do it, you had to go and to really sign up. I initially went and did one session and decided I want to find out more about this. So I signed up, And to sign up, you had to go for 2 weeks and work with a therapist one-to-one for 2 weeks with the therapist seeing nobody other than you. And that's what I did. And then I got so involved with that, and I worked with these people for 2 years very intensely, and eventually trained with them and became a therapist. So another big area of my understanding about the world, as well as ecology and soils and all that sort of stuff and entomology, is psychology and psychosocial processes. So my take is that there's a lot that's going on personally that doesn't get adequately engaged in things like social change. Like we can be thinking right now, we need to see global transformation in relation to climate change, in relation to war, in relation to sustainability and social justice, and et cetera, et cetera. And usually we think, well, to do that, we've got to transform our organizations, to start thinking about better political ways of doing things and better cultural ways of doing things and so forth. But actually, all of that is dependent on personal transformation. So that's the foundation, the soil that is actually the starting point for really meaningful global transformation. So it comes down to, for each of us, thinking not what do they need to do. People often use that example of pointing at something. When you point at something with one finger, there's 3 fingers that are pointing at you. And that's the one that really needs to be getting into action. So psychologically, these are my starting assumptions. And this is how we all start out, is that at every moment, however critical we are of anybody, we're always doing the best we can, given three interrelated things. The first is our genetics. So clearly you can't be a champion sprinter if you're born with no legs. So, and genetics does have a role to play. And now our understanding of genetics is somewhat broader than everything is not just genes, but other things we inherit. Secondly, our past experiences and how we adapted to them. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But all of us in our Western society were born traumatized. So if you look at a primitive Ethiopian birth, from beginning to end, it takes on average about 20 minutes. The average Western birth takes 7 hours. If you're genetically designed for a 20-minute experience and you have to survive 7 hours getting born in the womb, it's a traumatic experience that comes with a whole lot of tissue level expectations of dying that all of us experienced. And that didn't have no effect on us. It affected all of us in ways that the only way we've survived it is to deny it and not focus on it and not think about it. So that is really important to acknowledge. That is our heritage. And then the third thing that affects what is happening at any moment is the context. If you're in a supportive context, if you're in a disruptive context, if you're in prison, you're not able to go out and do all sorts of things that you can do if you're not in prison. So that basic relationship between the person, their past, and the environment, and the relationship between those things is what affects our understandings, our values, our ethics, and all those things affect our actions. And those actions occur in an environment that can vary between supportive and disruptive and oppressive. So that sort of is what can be applied to any area is that 4-part model. So how does all this happen? Like I talked about how we got traumatized as a child. We all start out potentially whole, as a whole being. And I refer to that as our potential core self, our core, healthy, essential self. What happens is, for all of us, it got bashed in. Birth, for most of us, occurred in a hospital. It was set up in a hospital for the convenience of the doctor, not particularly for the mother, and certainly not for the child. So you're born in a room with fluorescent lighting. You're pulled out of the dark in a warm environment to a much colder environment with evaporation occurring on your body. And for most of us, we got slapped. The first trauma, well, one of the many traumas. So this,
and the woman lying on her back as well
oh
restricts
yeah,
blood flow to the fetus, so the worst way to do it,
yeah,
but convenient for the doctor.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And even, people saying, oh, it's much better if you're squatting, or it's much better if you're doing it in water. All the resistance that occurs. Oh, no, 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 no. I'm not some bloody greenie, or I'm not this, or, all those things get labeled. One of the ways we stop things happening is to label them in negative ways. And anyway, so that hurt can only be dealt with for each of us by developing an adaptation to survive the hurt. And so I remember learning this when I was at McGill. I used to give lectures in the main campus with very large classes of 1,000 people, and I'd be wandering up and down the walkways between the students. And I remember I would often be gesticulating with my arms. And I noticed one day when I was raising my arm, there were a whole lot of students in the rows near where I raised my arm that were ducking. And I realized these students would have been hit over the head as a child. And subconsciously, when they saw an arm go up, they were still in their 20s ducking, with the possibility that they might be hit over the head. Now, again, anything you see going on anywhere is going on everywhere. So that is just a small expression and an easily visible understanding of what's going on about adaptation. So all of us have got hundreds and hundreds of adaptations. So there will be numerous hurts and numerous adaptations. I remember when my son was born, he was being breastfed, and not by me, although he tried to get milk out of my nose regularly. And well-meaning neighbors would say, knowing this, they would say, oh, you should get some real food into that child. Because he was still fairly skinny, he wasn't fat, like a little fat tubby baby. And incidentally, why we get fat babies is because they were given cow's milk and they're eating to be stimulated, not to be nourished. And so they're all overeating, and so they all get tubby and chubby, and where we've got obesity as a major problem in our society. Anyway, so yeah, I remember buying some baby food and warming it up and putting in a spoonful and sticking a spoonful of this stuff in his mouth. And when I put this in his mouth, he immediately spat it out like this. And I'd paid for this shit, so I scraped it back up and put it back in. And he learned that he's going to have to swallow the shit to get the love. And that is essentially the core process that went on for all of us around adaptation and having to survive all the sort of things we had to survive, like sitting in a classroom in rows, facing forwards, doing what the teacher said. And I'll come back to this in a moment, or in a little while, because there's a whole lot of learning around this process. So the outcome is that the end point is that all of us are made up of multiple selves, a whole lot of adaptive compensatory selves, and a core self, a residual core self. Now, the important thing about this is to notice the difference between expressions of our core self and of our maladaptive selves, which are essentially the opposites. Our core self is spontaneous, in the present, fully aware, fully empowered, acting on love and acting on informed action, or engaging in informed action. Our maladaptive selves have all had to develop patterned behaviours to survive the traumas. We very easily go out of the present into the past and the future. And we're obsessed with the future and the past in our society. We've got closed off awareness. So often when I talk about things like life in the soil, oh, I've never seen any life in the soil. You know, and we're disempowered. You ask people, so why didn't you, like my wife told me a story last night. She was coming home and there was an accident. She came up to an accident, two cars that had collided, and there was broken glass everywhere. And she pulled over to stop to help the people. 6 cars went past while she was there that didn't stop, you know, and people were disempowered. They were afraid to they didn't think they could be helpful. You know, she sat and talked to each of those people and made sure the police and the ambulance were coming and all the rest of it. And it was incredibly reassuring for those 2 women who were involved in the accident to be able to talk to somebody and get a hug and be told, this is all going to be all right. Don't worry. Let's just wait till they come. And so most people are acting on fear, and they're not acting on informed action, but they're acting out or postponing. So those are the big, you know, if people say, what are the barriers in our society to meaningful social change? It's the dominance of patterned behaviors, being out of the present, limited awareness, being disempowered, acting on fear and postponing, and just automatically acting out, doing something to look like you're busy and doing something. So this is the oh, wait a minute. Now I've got to, now I've got, how do I get back to my screen? Oh no. Oh, I don't know how I get back to my screen. My screen. Oh, okay. Yeah. No, that doesn't work. View. Do I press share again? No.
Yeah, try sharing again.
Oh. Didn't work.
And then you did the button
Oh yeah. Okay. Wait a minute.
as a little TV thing on a stand.
Sorry, guys. I was just called out. Our daughter's at this moment in the process of buying a house.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So and there's a question of putting down an offer and so. Anyway, yeah. Please go on. Yeah.
I don't know how to make it go on again now. Oh, Zoom.
What do you want to go on there, Stu?
Just to go, so you can see the next slide.
Oh, yeah.
Well, see on the left-hand side, you've got a whole list of slides and there's a
Yeah.
scroll bar. You can scroll down the slide you want.
Just
No,
click
see,
on
it won't
To
move.
come back to the full screen again.
Oh,
If you go to that little arrow thing, the slidey.
Scroll down.
Stu, is your mouse cursor responding to your mouse movements?
no.
Ah.
Right. Well,
View.
that's.
Oh, a minute. View.
Could I suggest that for a moment you go out of screen share? Although you
Oh,
can't.
full screen. No? Okay, sorry.
Screen, yeah, that might work.
Out of screen share. Oh,
But you can't get there without moving your mouse.
oh, okay. Oh, there we go.
Oh,
Is
here we
that
go.
it? That's it.
Yep. Hypnotized.
Except now now I've got, oh, did we do this one? Yeah, we did. We already did
No,
this.
you just
Oh, no, we
started
didn't. We didn't do this one. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is how it occurs. And R.D. Laing, the Scottish psychiatrist, wrote a book about all this stuff. And he said that all of us behave as if we've been hypnotized twice. Firstly, into accepting pseudo-reality as reality. And secondly, into believing we've not been hypnotized. And that's why it's very difficult to persuade anybody of any new idea, because our attachment to what we think we understand is a double hypnosis, is not just this is my reality, and I don't think I'm confused about my reality. I'm in denial about the possibility of being confused about my reality. So it's as if we've all been hypnotized twice. And that's why it's difficult to make a change. And the outcome is there's a whole lot of the world that we don't see. For example, on the left, that's a carrot. When you pull a carrot up, the carrot actually leaves most of the carrot in the ground. The roots of the carrot go down 2 meters.
Huh.
And the onion goes down about 1 meter when you pull the onion up. There's a little bit of onion roots on the bottom of the onion, but most of the onion is left in the soil. And that, again, my thing is anything you see anywhere is what's going on everywhere. So my explanations to you right now are only a fraction of my story. And the reason we get comfortable with that is this is the situation for most of us. We're looking for safety and security so much of the time. And getting out of that is really risky. And the outcome is our view is very limited. So most of what is not seen. And we see that, the great excitement about recycling. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Yes, that's what we should be doing. This is what we don't see. And this was just after about a 10-minute exercise of me brainstorming other R words. And this were only the R words I could put up on a screen where you could still read them. There were about 100 other R words that I came up with in my brainstorming. And then there's all the other letters of the alphabet, and there was all the other alphabets. And so this is what we don't look at in terms of bringing about change, is masses of stuff that's available to us. So people say it's hopeless. Nothing is hopeless. There's massive amounts of things that could be done. We just need to be willing to start at a point that adds a few more bits and pieces that we haven't taken into account. So most of us see the world like this guy productively sawing logs. You think, wow, yeah, what a great thing to be doing. and then you see the rest of the picture. You know, and that's the outcome of most of these efforts that people make is that. And I actually started scribbling that on a piece of paper in a United Nations conference about the future. And the guy talking was essentially proposing doing something equivalent to the previous image. And I just started drawing that. And the person next to me, who was an artist, said, "Oh, let me draw a better version of that for you." And this is what she drew. And it turned out she was the daughter of the guy who was speaking. And she said, "I've never been able to get that through to him." Anyway, so every area is subject to this need for expanding our awareness. And particularly right now with what's going on in Israel and Palestine and in Ukraine and USSR and so forth, is Russia is subject to that same sort of thinking. And so you see over on the left, the focus on the issues between states, and we've got to find ways of having better ways to deal with war and so forth. It's not till you get right over onto the right-hand side of that image that acknowledges the relationship between inner peace and outer peace. And even Gaia understandings and intercultural peace and feminist peace and no violence communication and all that, they're all still limited. It's not till we really get out there and acknowledge the connection between inner and outer peace, and the inner peace is the foundation for developing outer peace. So you can't have, well, I got so many stories about this. I was at I was at a conference when a Nobel Prize winner who was in the hotel room next to me was about to give a keynote address on peace. And he realized that he had forgotten something that he needed for his presentation. And he came back to his room, and his wife was still in there, and he'd forgotten his key. And she was in the shower, I think. And he was having a fit outside their room, which I witnessed, really angry at her, before he was going off to give his lecture on peace. So there you go. He didn't connect the connection between inner and outer peace. Okay, so I'm a social ecologist, and partly social ecology is a challenge to the typical triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is the economy, society, and the environment. You know, and social ecology actually doesn't have a box for the economy. The economy is just a bit of society. Just the idea of isolating the economy is part of the problem, is privileging it over everything else. You ask people why we can't house the homeless. Oh, we haven't got enough resources. It's too difficult we can't afford to do it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The real bottom line, which is what social ecology is concerned with, is the planet is the bottom line. The economy is not the bottom line. That's where all the rules that that can't be changed exist. Within that foundation, we've got to develop socio-cultural, institutional structures, political processes, economic processes, business processes, educational, health processes, technology, etc., processes that enable us to maintain the well-being of the environment. And to do that, we need individuals and communities and groups and families, you and me, to come up with those institutional structures and processes to enable that primary ecological system to be healthy and be able to continue to support us. So that is the real triple bottom line. We have yet to discover that in our society. And that's what we were teaching people in social ecology. It's realizing that there's a connection between the inside and the outside. One of my neighbors in Canada, who is a cartoonist, drew this for me to help me illustrate this. Brilliant. It's an absolutely brilliant image. So when I came to social ecology and was made professor, the university employed me because they were finding the social ecology department was very difficult for them to manage. And they thought bringing in a big professor from McGill University would help straighten them all out. And they asked me to define social ecology after a while. And this is the definition I came up with, which is that everything that I'm saying and anything I've ever said is provisional. It's not, this is what it is. This is my provisional understanding. And this is what I wrote down in 2011 when I originally wrote it in 1995. And so it got slightly edited between then and now. So social ecology is the study and practice of the relationships between the personal, social, ecological in relation to sustainability and, in quotes, progressive change based on ecological, humanistic, relational, community, and, in quotes, spiritual, which for me is the unknown, values to enable sustained well-being of all. So that's what we were all about. And one of my colleagues in social ecology drew it as a diagram showing that relationship on the right between the personal and social and ecological, and on the left between ethics and knowledge and action and personal experience. And it's a cycle that you can see. It's an interacting cycle that goes between theory and practice. And, you know, I could give a whole talk on this one diagram, but anyway, you can see the story. So what my takeaway from understanding all this stuff is that we actually are facing a need to evolve psychosocially. We're caught up in a stage of our evolution, which is what can be characterized as a socializing stage. So if you ask people, why do you send your children to school? To socialize them. And what is happening to those children is they're not getting socialized, they're getting brainwashed. They're not getting socialized because we're born social. We're a social organism. We don't need to become social. We need to be enabled to act on our social potential. And that's not what goes on in school most of the time. It's mostly being forced to adopt somebody else's version of social, not enabling our version. And so one of the people who most powerfully illustrated this, and this I think has a lot to offer to general semantics, is Lloyd DeMause, who was from New York. And in fact, I was going to see him from Montreal when I got deep vein thrombosis on the plane traveling to Montreal to see my children. So I didn't get to go to New York and never got to meet him, but we corresponded for years. But he said, if you want to understand what's going on in society, you need to look at what's happening to children. And if you look at what's happened to children historically, we've gone through eras where infanticide was widespread, to children being abandoned, as happens with sending children to boarding school and sending children off to become priests and nuns and so forth, to ambivalent approaches towards children, to intrusive approaches, to what we're in now is what he called the socializing phase, which is the imposition of other people's agenda on the next generation. And what he argued for was a movement to, he called it a helping society, I call it an enabling society, where we enable us each to realize our potential. And so for me, enabling is recognizing that we are already social and we need to be enabled to act on this, and so forth. And I'll say a bit more about that. So socializing is, as I said, is the imposition by adults and society in general of foreign agendas, invariably inappropriate in content and with respect to current conditions of time and space, on children and others who, if not wounded, have their own benign, unique, personal, contextually fine-tuned agendas that are being sabotaged and undermined. And the outcome is, the only way children can survive this is to adapt and sacrifice their internal world and their connection to the external world and they do that moment to moment to survive. And if you look at most children, there's a spectrum of behaving in ways that conform and ways that rebel. And some children are predominantly rebellious and some children are predominantly conforming. And either of those are not helpful. I mean, they're helpful better than just being brainwashed. But what we need to be enabled is to be enabled to act on our potential, to act on our awareness, our capability for loving and caring and relating and visioning and acting and so forth, and having a zest for life. And you see this in children up till the age between 7 and 11 in Western society. Children are still subconsciously trying to act on their potential. And this is where a whole lot of conflicts occur, where, you know, people say, oh, that child is so hard to manage and so forth, because they haven't given up that zest for living and they haven't fully gone along with somebody else's agenda. But what you see, if your parents kept photos of you as a child and did pictures of you in primary school, and they had primary school class photos, you will see up to the age between 7 and 11, all those kids, or most of those kids, have bright eyes. They're all sort of grinning, poking each other, looking around, you know, they're alive. After 7 to 11, you look at those class photos, all those kids have got dead eyes. They look like they're looking out into the space saying, what the hell's going on? You know, and they've given up. And they had to give up to survive. And that's what has happened to most of us. And for me, teaching university was always a sad event part of the time. I'd come into the class and I'd look around and there would be a sea of dead eyes. And somehow I had to wake up those people from their sleep to engage them with the possibility of learning something. And that's where my lying exercise enabled that to happen. So getting to how do we enable change? Well, there are 5 stages that I recognize. The first is ignorance and denial. You say to people, well, what about biodiversity loss? Well, I haven't noticed any biodiversity loss. Or, well, we're losing mosquitoes. Well, we don't need mosquitoes. You know, we don't need cockroaches. People don't realize, they talk about the cockroach. There are 4,000 species of cockroach. etc., etc. 300,000 species of beetles, and most things, all of them not just doing problem things, but doing beneficial things. Eventually, you get some awareness and acknowledgement. Oh, I suppose there's probably some things going on about the climate. Yeah, but there's probably some things. And then we get some sort of understanding of it. And we say, yes, we'll put a solar collector on the house. We'll do something about it, And those are what I call project-based initiatives. Getting a recycling system, getting a solar collector on the house, getting a better nozzle on the shower, etc. What we've got to get to is not the sensible things that we're doing are a set of projects. We need to have a whole system, new way of doing things that becomes, this is how we now live. We no longer have an adversarial political system. It doesn't work. It never can work. We need a collaborative political system, which one of my students calls cooperacy. She wrote a book on cooperacy. It's the next step on from democracy. Democracy is just 50+1, which can never work in terms of peace, well-being for all, or anything. There's always people going to be less well off and always people who are better off. We need cooperacy, collaborative decision-making. How are we going to get there? Well, there's some things that we do, like adversarial politics, that we've got to stop doing. There's some things that we've got to stop, we can change by starting to reduce doing, to do slightly differently, and to do things that we've doing a little bit of, but expanding them, being more, expanding renewable resource-based living. And then some new things that we've yet to discover that we're open to, that we might be doing. So anybody who's thinking, what can we do to bring about change, actually has to have that list in front of them with things to do attached to each of those points. And any settling for just one of those little areas is never going to do it. It's a whole system. And we've got to answer the question, what will it take to do this? What might get in the way? How will we get around what gets in the way? What resources are we going to need? People and physical resources. How can we get them? Who are we going to ask? And it's really important to realize that this isn't a political driven thing. It's a personal thing that we've got to solve. It's highly context specific. And that's why formulaic, centrally directed and imposed changes can never work. It's what works is stuff that's emergent from individuals and small groups. And there's still an element in the literature I read about general semantics that's a little bit formulaic, a bit centrally directed, and wishing it could be imposed on everybody. we've got to let go of that stuff and start rewriting and writing some new general semantics literature. And those other things can never, as I say, never work. And some things have some elements of things that do work. And they're the seeds of things that need to be expanded. Now, I said about boldly lying. Now, that obviously is a constructed photograph. But the power of lying about what we've done that we haven't done is incredibly important to get each of us to get in touch with what it is that we really want to do and can do and will do. Because it comes from our core being. And it enables expressions of all those qualities of the core being. So if we start doing these things, we then actually need to have some testing questions to check. Is this the sort of thing that is going to work, is going to bring about reasonable change? And sociopolitically, it's got to help build trust between us and not keep thinking, oh, those people, I can't trust those people. We've got to find a way to trust everybody in the smallest meaningful way and to collaborate in the smallest meaningful, doable way. And that involves reflection, critical thinking, imagination, and also celebration, particularly to make good things contagious and to respect cultural diversity, not try to make everybody uniformly the same boring people and look at mutualistic relationships. So we're really talking about a psychosocial coevolution.
Sure.
Generally, that's going to involve being proactive, not reactive, and work with whole systems and work with design rather than problem solving. It's about small, meaningful, collaborative initiatives. It's looking for windows of and opportunities for change and using what I call integrator indicators as signs of whether things are going well. In ecology, the most well understood integrator indicators are top predators. When there are top predators there, like eagles and wolves and so forth, lions and tigers, that tells you everything below them on the food chain is working. When they disappear, it means the whole thing is vulnerable. And for me, in soil, the predatory mites were the integrator indicators of what was going on in soil, some of which, as I say, are named after me. And we need to be attentive to all outcomes and feedbacks, not just certain things like economics and power, but anything that's happening, notice it. Like my ability to notice is such that I can walk through a field of clovers and always find a four-leaf clover.
Wow.
And my wife said to me one day, oh, you think you're so clever, find a five-leaf clover. So I took 2 or 3 steps and I've immediately found a 5-leaf clover. The key is not searching the clover leaves. The key is not looking at 3-leaf clovers. I can find a 4-leaf clover by not looking at 3-leaf clovers. So to find feedback, you've got to not be distracted by what you normally see. You've got to be open to seeing new feedback. That's what I was doing as a psychotherapist. But I should tell you just a quick story, and there's just a few more slides and I'm finished. when I was working as a psychotherapist, I was driving along one day and I had this thought, what can I offer that's not available? And the thought I had was that, and I didn't know that there was anywhere because there were some people who were doing this, but at that time I thought there's nowhere you could go and do therapy where you can only go once. So I said to the next client who was coming to me, you can, and I was on sabbatic leave from the university, so I was very flexible. I said that you can come anytime you like, and the session could last as long as you like. The only thing is, I will only see you once.
Mm.
And so this woman came and she was working in the Canadian equivalent of a TAFE, and she wasn't getting on with her colleagues. And she said, I want to work on not getting on with my colleagues. And I used to do therapy in a padded cell with really thick walls and a mattress on the floor. And I would sit with the client on the floor and I would make some physical contact, hold their hand and look into their eyes and so forth, sitting on the mattress. So this is how we started a session. And so I'm paying attention to her and I noticed something. And so I asked her a question about what I noticed, or I commented. I noticed that you something. And that opens up the possibility of people saying some more about what's going on. So she started talking about something. And what she started talking about had nothing directly to do with not getting on with her colleagues. And it led her to tell me her story was that she had been raped. I'm going to start feeling quite teary telling you about this because it really affected me. She told me she'd been raped when she was 8 and she'd gone to a girls' boarding school and her elder sister was head girl and she'd protected her from bullies. But because she was older, she'd left before she left. And when she left, she was no longer protected and she got bullied. And she'd had all these traumatic experiences. And afterward, and she did amazing work in this hour. I should say, out of all the hundreds of sessions, single sessions I did with people, only one went over 2 hours. Everyone went over an hour, but everyone was finished before 2 hours on their decision to finish, not mine. And when she finished, I said, this was my first session doing this. I said, look, I don't normally comment, but I must say you have done amazing work. And she had talked to me a little bit about being in Jungian analysis. She'd been in Jungian analysis twice a week for 2 years at $80 a shot. And so I said to her, I guess those things you worked on, you would have gone over so many times with your analyst. And she looked at me wide-eyed and she said, oh, I've never mentioned any of those things to the analyst.
Wow.
And then I realized, the question I had in my mind was, how common is this? And out of all those hundreds of sessions I did with people, this was the norm, that most people never deal with the issues that are foundational. They deal with preliminary and related issues. And the reason they're dealing with those other issues is subconsciously, they're trying to find out if they work on the really foundational issues, that the therapist will not let them die. Because when those things happen to them as a child, it really touches me thinking about it. When those things happened to them, they didn't have language. They just were functioning like any animal, but aware of a traumatic experience that they could die. They were aware as a baby, even in the womb, that they could die. And to work on that stuff in therapy, the therapist has to assure them they're not going to let them die. And it's incredibly courageous for people to risk the possibility of dying if they work on their trauma, their foundational traumas. So most people never work on their foundational traumas. And so what happened in the sessions I did with people, I hadn't realized that when I said to people, I will only see you once, I was actually saying to them two things. One that's obvious is that this is your only chance, that gave them, in a sense, the courage to have a go. And the other was that they surmised that they would only see me once if they were up to seeing me once, which would translate to they actually were capable of not letting me die.
Wow.
So every one of those people worked on stuff that they had never worked on in therapy, however important that therapy was. And the most dramatic one was a woman who was a senator in the Canadian government who was an nymphomaniac. She had had sex with nearly every male in the House of Parliament in Canada, to the point where she was going into the men's toilet to find new men to have sex with. And she had been in therapy for 25 years. She had seduced every psychologist that she'd gone to on the eastern seaboard of America. And when she came to do a session with me, she was flying to Los Angeles and San Francisco to find new therapists who she could seduce. And of course, she tried to seduce me. And because I wouldn't be seduced, she had to deal with her pattern of behavior. And afterwards, she stopped being an nymphomaniac. And I got numerous politicians referred to me for single sessions who were people who she had had sex with.
Wow.
So that's really, really important information I'm telling you, that is the dominant situation in our society, is the dominant situation for all of our politicians, all of our priests, all of our social leaders, all of our educators, that they're all likely to be carrying around unresolved traumas that are directing how they're functioning. Now, I want to tell you something very helpful. Way back in the 60s, I became friends of a woman who was secretary to this man on the left, and that's Scott Williamson and his wife, Inez Pierce. And back in the 1920s, they were students in medicine in England with high ideals of trying to make people healthy. And they set up a clinic in a place called Peckham near London. And the funding they could get was to advise people about birth control. And so this was the population they had, people who they could be advising about birth control. And because they were passionate about getting people well, they decided that they would use this population to measure their health and try and monitor what happens to their health. So they measured their population, hundreds of people who came to them, and they found that 90% of the population had detectable disorders. They were sick, but only 60 to 70% of them knew they were sick. Only 60 to 70% of them didn't know they were sick. Only 20% of them knew they were sick. So they divided the population to people who were sick. There were only 10% of the population who were healthy. So they divided the population into 10% that were healthy, 20% that were sick, and the majority, 60 to 70%, that were sick but didn't know they were sick, and they called those the compensatory people, which relates to my image that I showed you of our compensatory selves. So that connects to our compensatory selves. So they were absolutely passionate about following through on this. So they petitioned the government and some wealthy people, and they managed to get funding to build this building, which was a community center in Peckham. And over the time they operated it, it had over 1,000 families. And at any moment, there were over 500 families in there using this facility. And they had, in the middle of it, they had a warm water swimming pool surrounded by an organic food cafeteria and a gymnasium and numerous rooms where you could do things, play music, create plays, roller skate, play games, all sorts of things. And between all of these rooms, except the toilets, there were glass walls. So wherever you were, you could see all the other things that were going on in this. And people came to use this facility from Peckham, and you had to join as a family, and you paid a small fee, like 2 and 6pence a week or something. And you were free to do whatever you wanted to do in this building. There was nothing organized for you. They didn't say, we're going to have swimming classes today or whatever. When you came in, you could look around, see what's going on in the gymnasium. That looks interesting. I'm going to go and do that. Or swimming. And there was very minimal supervision. And as I say, a cafeteria. And the only agreement they had with people was that they wanted to monitor what people did and how that might affect their health. And occasionally they gave some talks, but there was no manipulation of anybody. So this is what happened. It operated for 12 years and it was closed during the war. And then it operated for a bit afterwards. And this is the gymnasium, for example, that everybody was allowed to go and use and do whatever they wanted to do without being supervised. So you could even be a 3-year-old climbing up those bars on the right with nobody watching you. In this period of the existence of this Peckham experiment of over 1,000 families, there wasn't a single marriage breakdown. There wasn't a single case of bullying between children. Just imagine that in relation to what happens in our current society and what happened to that poor breakdance woman in the Olympics, the bullying that occurred to her. There was only a single accident in those 12 years, which was an adult who dived over the long box and broke a finger or a thumb, I think. There wasn't a single accident other than that single accident of that adult. Not a single accident among children and zero bullying. There was virtually no competitive games. When I started out talking about how competitive games are an obsession in our society, there was no interest in competitive games. There was phenomenal collaboration and joint projects. They wrote symphonies, they wrote plays, they had projects, they grew their own vegetables. Phenomenal ability to do things. When it got set up, I think 2% of married women knew how to swim. When it closed, 60 or 70% of the married women knew how to swim. Nobody had set out to teach married women how to swim. They'd chosen to develop that ability. And what happened is when they came into that center each day, each individual looked around to see what they wanted to do, and one thing attracted their attention. And they then, what they have found was they would do that one thing every day for however many days it took them to develop the competence that they wanted to develop, their personal learning agenda. It was the opposite of what we do in schools. And it was opposite from each individual was unique. And they improved their health and well-being phenomenally. And phenomenally creative. So what was the key? They had a supportive environment. They were absolutely free to be spontaneous, to choose what they wanted to do. That you can see the diving board. There was a high board above that pool, and somebody would come in and decide, today's the day I'm going to try and learn how to dive off the high board. Somehow they would have taken in all that's required from their peripheral vision of watching people dive to be able to go and dive reasonably off the high board at the moment they chose to dive. They found that to enable that sort of thing, they got somebody to build little miniature bicycles with no training wheels that they had available in the building for them to ride. What they noticed was when the child chose to ride a bicycle, not some adult holding the back of the bicycle and getting them started, when that child chose to ride a bicycle, having taken in all they needed to know to be able to ride a bicycle from their peripheral vision, they walked over to it, got on the bike, and rode perfectly straight away. That is a complete rarity in our society. And that needs to become the norm of this is how we now live. There was non-judgmental feedback, opposite of the feedback we get in our society. Phenomenally supportive staff. And the doctors realized that there were moments when people were particularly open to learning. Puberty, forming primary relationships, getting pregnant, giving birth, and so forth. They were really powerful windows for change. And as I said, they as usual, women leading the process, set up an organic farm where they grew all their projects. The doctors were interviewed about health because they were primarily interested in the health aspects. What they said was, we noticed that health was contagious in this environment. Just like disease is contagious, health was contagious. And people asked them, what is the key to health? And people thought they're going to say diet and exercise or something like that, or attitude. They said, actually, the key to health is spontaneity. It's linked to my bold lying. The bold lie we come up with is what we spontaneously come up with in that moment, in that context. Spontaneity is the key to health. And they said further than that, health is a facility for mutual synthesis with others and the environment. Now, I have worked on medical projects throughout much of my life. I am yet to ever meet a practitioner in the health profession who is familiar with the Peckham experiment. This should be core material for all people involved in health. And one of the popular books about it is by a friend of mine who's now dead, unfortunately, called Being Me and Also Us. And it's called that because people said, oh, well, you know, what's the key? And the key was relationship, being in relationship, not just looking after myself, but us becoming healthier. Okay, this is absolutely the end. This is my characterization, a simple, oversimplified version of the society we live in. It's dominated by socializing, which is about manipulation and people making decisions on the basis of fear, over-focus on problem solving, which is a reactive behavior, and hierarchical top-down social institutions that excludes nearly everybody. What we need is, this is how we now live, is a love-based enabling society with a focus on design and proaction and deep understanding of things that includes the unknown, and participatory social institutions, which is best characterized as cooperacy. And that's what my gift is to you today and to the rest of society. Now, I did want to end with a summary slide. And as you can see, this summarizes everything I've been talking about quite simply. Actually, I put it upside down, so I'm going to make it difficult to see. So I'll put it the right way up so you can all see it. Maybe not. Let's make it visible. Now you go back. You can see it now, can't you? That is how you enable social change. You enable making things visible that have not been visible before, so that they can never be denied again. It also requires commitment. It doesn't work if we're half committed.
Nice diagram.
And it also involves stickability, being willing to continue going through periods when it's really hard, and carry on with ups and downs to the social process. And I just have to end with my absolute favorite cartoon. It says, well, you've been a pretty good horse, I guess, hardworking, not the fastest critter I ever come across, but
No, stupid.
isn't that a good cartoon?
Yep, that's very good.
And that's it. I'm done.
Questions, the answers.
So
That
that's
PECM experiment
that's
reminded
the
me a
gift
bit.
I could give you.
I don't know if you can hear me. Heading towards Montessori education is sort of trying to get a little bit that way from normal education.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah. So let me screen sharing. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. No, there we go. Let me.
Yeah, no, that's right. We've ended screen share.
Okay. View. Let me view
Still
you all. There we go.
Still recording. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my story.
That was absolutely fascinating, and I learned so much. Thank you so much, Stuart.
Yeah.
And if there's, you know, any bits of that anybody wants any more about, you're welcome to write me, and I'll, you know, part of the danger is that I've published between 300 and 400 papers now. So it's very hard for me to not send too many things when people write me.
Yes.
But if you say what you're particularly interested in, if you write me, I will try and pick out 2 or 3 things that are related to what you're interested in. And I should say, I mean, the reason I've written so many is when I was at school, I was in the rebellion phase. and they didn't fully colonize me. So I was a terrible student. I was always more interested with what I could see out of the window than what was going on at the front of the class. And eventually they threw me out and said, "You're not fit for the sixth form." And I went to the local technical college because I was always interested in biology. And I found the teacher who was teaching biology. And I said to him, and I was working in a factory and studying part-time, and I was going to do A-level zoology and botany. And I said to him, I'm a very poor student. I know it's a 2-year program. Would you be willing for me to do it in 3 years? And I didn't know that he was actually a Marxist biologist from Poland. And he was the protege of Sir Alister Hardy, who was the person who opened up the whole field of marine biology, who written a book on plankton and a book on fish. And this was he was his primary student. His name was Joe Bazzani. And he looked at me for a long time and he shook his head. And I thought, oh, rejected again. And he recognized exactly what I needed. He said, no, we're not going to do it in 3 years. In fact, I'm going to feel teary again. We're not going to do it in 2 years. We'll do it in 1 year. And so I did it in 1 year.
Wow.
And I had my PhD by the time I was 24 and got the prize for the best PhD and the best student and all the rest of it, and did the first whole ecosystem study by an individual in the world way
Wow.
back in the mid-60s. And then became a professor in McGill University and da-di-da-di-da. And I was psychotherapist to a royal family.
Wow.
Right.
Incredible.
Stu, the bottom of your, in fact, the bottom of your emails
Yeah,
has an address at the UWS Penrith and
yeah,
so forth campus. Can we use that as an address for you?
yeah, absolutely.
And you've also got of course, the email address on the web. So we'll put that on the website.
Yeah, feel free to.
If you're welcome.
Yeah, and
those
any
sort of
and any
comments.
comments you want to make about this. I mean, you know, there's probably, like for me, what I've presented you with, in a sense, is my dot.
Yes.
So there's still all the rest of that, you know. And I'm an addictive learner. So I have I think, did I say it at the beginning? I have a practice every day of writing to somebody who I've never. So I've already written to somebody today who I saw something on the web, and I've written to who's a leader of regenerative agriculture in Tasmania, in Hobart, as a way of connecting with somebody. And so for me, it's an opportunity to learn from that person. So before writing to that person, I actually looked them up and downloaded a whole lot of things that they've written. And so I sort of feel I'm half already a friend to them. And sometimes I send what I've downloaded and put together as a several-page document to them and say, this is what I already found out about you.
Yeah.
They'd probably be quite touched by that.
Yeah. So
thank you for giving part of your true self today, Stuart.
well, thanks,
It's very
Brett.
appreciative.
Yeah.
Inspiring.
I should say, you know, when I looked at each of you, I already had a feeling of connection. So there's a bit of me that already loves you.
Oh, lovely. And
Isn't that
same here, we could see what a kind and how you feel things deeply is so lovely.
Yes. Stu, if you follow up Lance Straight on Facebook, you learn a lot more about him also from the.
Well, I did the process with him, you see. I've got a big file on Lance lots of things downloaded, and I wrote him. But like a lot of people, and it was good and disappointing for me. He wrote back and said, "Thank you. I appreciate what you sent to me. I'll get back to you again later." But he never did.
No, that's very common, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's it's for me. It's I'm got a old man drippy nose from me tearing up.
How long ago did you write to him?
Oh, straight after he gave his talk.
Right. I think he's been in Europe for a lot of that. So
yeah. I mean, everybody's got busy lives. We've all got busy lives, but I've got a busy life too. You know, I maintain a big garden. In fact, before I started today, I'd already gone round our garden picking out the flickweed, because this time of the year, flickweed has a little white flower on the top of it, and so it gives itself away where it is in the lawn. So I can wander around the lawn and pull out the flickweed, and if I let that flickweed stay, the seeds dry, and each plant has about 500 seeds.
Oh, wow.
And it's called flickweed because they burst and they shoot the seeds all over everywhere.
Oh, yes.
And so instead of one plant, you've got 500. And so by me being on top of the flickweed at this time of the year, which I know, for me, it's substituting knowledge and skill for input. Like if I didn't do that, I'd then have to come out with a pesticide and control the flickweed. And I don't want to use a pesticide because the system isn't got flickweed because of deficiency of pesticide in the system.
Yes. Or you could use a lawnmower.
For every one that you pick up, you're saving having to pick up 500 later on.
Yeah. And you see, you can't use a lawnmower. Like a neighbor who doesn't do what I do said, "Do you want my grass cuttings?" And all his grass cuttings is full of flickweed seed. So I said, "No, I don't want your grass cuttings." So my grass cuttings has no obnoxious weeds in it. So I can compost it with safety. So I have 8 compost heaps.
Wow.
So there's always one ready to dig out and distribute.
Yeah.
Actually, I think with Lance Strait, I'll check, or Pauline's much better at this than I am. Check in Facebook. I think there was a crisis with his daughter. Jean, is that right? That his daughter is at home in somewhat disabled.
Autistic.
Yeah. Now I don't know if she died or if there was some crisis, because there was some mention in Facebook about it.
Well, I certainly picked up that we were compatible, and I was looking forward to. I mean, I think the other starting point for me in engaging with people is to assume, to not assume everybody is available for communication. To rather paradoxically assume that all of us are wounded. We're also not wounded, but all of us are wounded, and all of us have issues that we're dealing with. And some of those issues are priority over anything I might want. And time and place. And quite often I get an email. It usually starts out, "You probably won't remember me. And you gave a talk way back, and you said if I wanted to communicate with you, I could, and I never have, but I am now." When I was in primary school, in the last class, we had double desks, and the teacher, who was the headmistress, must have decided I was the one who might have some potential for being helpful. And so in the person next to me in the desk was completely deaf and dumb.
Wow.
I had to find a way to communicate to this boy, Michael Byford, his name was, and he was from the council, local council housing estate, and the rest, well, half of his family was in prison, and he was deaf and dumb, and I had to find a way to communicate with him so that he would not be disruptive in every class, and that was a gift for me that he gave me.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, Alexander Graham Bell was doing that. And
Yeah,
he taught the deaf and dumb people using a balloon, put their fingers on the balloon, and they could feel the vibrations in it.
fantastic. Yeah, yeah. Well, I had to do it without a balloon,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I somehow we were able to communicate,
Wow.
and there was some sort of a love between us of caring,
Yeah.
and yeah. So yeah, there have been so many precious experiences in my life of gifts that people have given me that I would never have had if I hadn't been in whatever the situation was. Well, one other one that's an interesting one, I got lost in, I like the ecological study I did was of the life in a cave in Trinidad that had 250,000 bats in it. And so lots of bat guano, which got me interested in soil. And I came out of that cave one day, and I used to sleep in a hammock in the forest. And one day when I woke up on the hammock, there was a three-toed sloth sleeping on the branch next to me.
Oh,
Anyway, I saw one of these morpho butterflies, these beautiful blue butterflies, and I followed it. I thought I'll follow this, and then I got lost in the jungle, and I did the classic thing where you go in a circle, kept coming back to where I was lost, and I couldn't find the way back to the cave or the path. And then in the distance, I saw a guy who had very few clothes on, and he had a big machete, no shoes, and a machete. And he would have been an escaped criminal who would have lived in the jungle.
oh,
And
wow.
I had to decide what to do. Would I call out to him and ask him to help me find the way back to the cave, or was I going to be lunch? So I called out to him in my best Trinidadian, and I said, "Alos, I'm lost," you see. And he said, "Where you lost?" I said, "Tamana." And then I remembered that in Trinidad, they have a mythology that the devil lives in the cave, and they're very afraid of the devil, and they call the devil Duende Man. And he said, "Where you lost?" I said, Tamana Cave. I said, "You can take me back there?" He said, "Oh," and then I said, "Duende Man." And he took me straight back through the jungle to the cave mouth. And I turned around to thank him, and it disappeared. That was another gift I received. One other, and I won't keep going on, but the last gift I received that I'd share with you, and there've been too many, was when I was in my 30s, working really hard at McGill. I'd got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to mark papers, and I was going off to another university. This was in the winter to give a talk. I was really tired, and I fell asleep driving the car on the highway going from Montreal to Sherbrooke, where this university was. And I must have put my foot down on the accelerator, and I caught up with an articulated truck and slammed into the back of this truck. And at that moment, I was absolutely sure I was going to die. And the only thing that I did, and this was the gift that I gave to myself, was I said aloud, "Life's been so good." And I wasn't thinking, oh shit, I forgot to put the garbage out, or I didn't do this, or I'm going to die. My only thought was appreciation and gratitude for having lived. And at that moment, the double wheels of the truck caught my bumper bar on the Toyota, and it ripped the bumper bar off and threw the car across the road. And there was an area of grass covered in snow between the two lanes of the highway, and I'm flying across this middle bit, and then I see all the cars coming towards me. Oh, this is when I'm going to die. And then I thought, oh no, I mustn't cause somebody to die, cause an accident. So I steered the car so I avoided all the traffic. And then there was a rock face in front of me. And the car went slam into this rock face, and the engine fell out, which is what happens in a Toyota. And the windscreen broke, and I thought, I'm next. And then I didn't die. And I switched the engine off, and took the key out and put it in my pocket. I undid the seatbelt and got out of the car. And the truck driver had already phoned an ambulance because he was aware something had hit him. And there was an ambulance there within minutes. And they put me in the back of the ambulance. This is all dark at night. And this is Quebec, where everybody is a Catholic. And eventually the police came, and the policeman came, and I was in the ambulance held down and so forth. And the policeman came, and this is all in French. Oh, you have to come out. You have to come out. And so it was really difficult for me to get up and get out. And I came out, and he was kneeling in front of this rock face praying. And then I looked up at the rock face, and what was on the rock face was this enormous heart that was drawn on the rock face. And he said, God's got more work for you to do. He didn't let you die, And yeah. And so in a way, that was another amazing gift, to know that my only thought at the moment of death was gratitude.